I'm David Spears. Welcome to Insiders. The Prime Minister's arrived back from the APEC summit this morning, where he had at least two friendly chats on the sidelines with the Chinese president. But an ugly encounter at sea has revealed just how difficult the relationship with Beijing remains. The government says Australian Navy divers from HMAS Toowoomba suffered minor injuries after being hit with sonar pulses from a Chinese vessel. It's not the only headache Anthony Albanese returns to. Labor appeared flat-footed in Parliament over its response to a High Court ruling that's now led to the release of more than 90 immigration detainees, including murderers and sex offenders. Ministers initially defended conditions placed on the cohort, but under pressure from Peter Dutton, eventually capitulated to opposition demands and applied much tougher rules. Shortly, I'll be joined by the Shadow Home Affairs Minister, James Paterson. First, the panel, Karen Middleton, Phil Curry and Shalila Medoro. Karen, let's start with what we know and what we don't know about those who have been released. The number is now up to 93 as of this morning. It's gone up every other day. Yeah. What do we know about them, firstly?
All of these people have issues around character to varying degrees. A number of them have been convicted of very serious offences. I think the Immigration Minister said 3 people are murderers. We don't know how many sex offenders. There are a range of people involved. 4 different categories they're divided up into, but all of them are either stateless or cannot be returned to the country that they came from. You know, in one case we know somebody convicted in their home country in Malaysia would face the death penalty if they were sent back, and Australia has a policy we do not return people to a country where they would be put to death. So there's a range of reasons. These are all people who have serious character questions, and they are in this position because they are not Australian citizens, they're foreign citizens.
So the Minister yesterday, Andrew Giles, was asked about how many and how serious are the offences. Here's what he said.
A significant number of those who have been required to be released, and I should say that 93 people have now been released. All of them are on visas with strict conditions. A large number of those, a significant number, are people who have been convicted of serious offences.
Yeah, so a significant number, a large number, doesn't say it's a majority. Shalila, presumably there are some who aren't as serious but still now will be subjected to the ankle bracelets, curfews and so on.
That's right, yeah. There's quite a few in that cohort, from my understanding, that haven't been convicted at all. So the character references or the character issues may involve things like having an adverse security finding, for example, which ASIO doesn't disclose the reasons for that. We know there are some people in that cohort who committed offences when they were minors, things like assaults as part of, gang-related issues when they were children. There are people in there who had drug offences committed due to past addictions that are still part of this cohort. In some instances, the time they have been in immigration detention is 3-, 4-, 5-fold what their original sentence might have been. So the proportionality here is a real question. And the vast majority of them aren't sex offenders, but will still be subject to mandatory conditions around reporting if they have contact with vulnerable children, for example, even though they might not have committed a sex offence.
And how much discretion, Phil, is there when it comes to the ankle bracelets, curfews and the rest of it? Is it blanket?
No, it's unclear still. I mean, when Labor, when Labor proposed this bill in a mad rush on Wednesday, the Minister would apply these measures on a case-by-case basis, and the Coalition said that's not good enough. We want them across the board for all of these people, regardless of the gravity or otherwise of what they've done. And the government went back and got legal advice. Said, well, if we do that, we'll just wind back in the High Court again and we'll lose for the same reasons, of the decision last week. So there's James Paterson may be able to explain this a bit better when he's on soon, but there is an element, I think, of discretion, but it's nowhere near what it used to be. And that was based on legal advice to try and ward off another High Court challenge against this bill.
Well, just on that, there is obviously the risk that this is challenged, and there are some critics of what the government and the opposition have done with this and worried where it might end up.
They send a message that every one of those in the cohort of 83 is somehow a danger to the Australian community, which is simply not the case. I think the problem is if you pass legislation in an atmosphere of hysteria and whipped up fear, and you do it within the matter of, 24, 48 hours, inevitably you're going to get poor drafting, inevitably you're going to get concepts which may unravel in court challenges.
Yeah, it's Greg Barnes there, Karen.
One of the important things I think to remember here, David, is if these were Australian citizens, then many of them, having served their sentence, found by a court, convicted and served their sentence, would be allowed to be in the community. It's because they're not citizens that they're in this circumstance. Now, if you talk to someone like Professor Kim Rubenstein from the University of Canberra, who's one of the foremost citizenship constitutional experts in the country, she raises the question about whether a court could look at what has now been done and say, well, this may be punitive because it's applying a regime to people who are not Australians that doesn't apply to people who are Australians. So there is still a legal question around what has already been done. And then there's the question about what the government may have to tweak in terms of the legislation, because we haven't yet seen the court's reasons. And until the government understands fully why the court reached the conclusion it did, it doesn't know the points of law that it needs to address.
Well, I said they'll legislate again, possibly.
Yeah.
But I think the fundamental fact here is, had they been prepared with something that was thought through, rather than, rush through the joint with such, rude haste in 24 hours, a bit like the Strawberries Bill, then we wouldn't have all these sort of these loose ends, as Greg Barnes was saying. I think clearly there's bad law here, and because of the sort of blanket application of these things. And so it goes back to the initial criticism of the government and not just by external critics, by a lot of its backbench, that had they had a contingency thought through and planned.
Well, that brings us to this point, right?
Then we wouldn't probably have all these loose ends and the potential for such bad law.
How ready was the government for this High Court ruling that came down 10 days ago or so? It did overturn 20-year precedent, so maybe some were surprised, but governments need to prepare for contingencies. The Home Affairs Minister, Claire O'Neill, was on Sky News this morning. She has revealed that her own department, the Home Affairs Department, advised the government they were going to win this case.
We knew that it was 20 years of legal precedent, and we were advised that it was likely that the Commonwealth would win the case, that is, allow us to do what we wanted to do, which is keep these people in detention. We received that advice from the Department of Home Affairs, who tell us what chances we have of success and failure in each legal case.
So the department told us it'd be okay.
Well, it's confusing because she said we had properly prepared for the decision. Now, if that is true, they had to have properly prepared for either decision.
And they say they were prepared.
So they say they were prepared, but we didn't see legislation until this week. Now, maybe you would argue that they left it until they finally got a decision to finalise legislation. And of course, they then had to negotiate with some other party in the parliament to get it through. Now, the government makes the point they were either going to have to deal with the Greens to get it through the Senate or deal with the coalition. And what they've done is they've gone with the coalition and they've agreed with amendments the coalition have put forward. And people are saying to me that they think that they're, quote unquote, not entirely unreasonable from the government, those amendments. So that's interesting.
Well, yeah, there are mixed views in Labor, I suppose, on how reasonable or otherwise this
Correct.
outcome is.
But they didn't do nothing. I mean, they did have, as soon as it happened, remember, the Minister Giles stood up and said they're subject to these visa requirements of having to report movements and this sort of stuff. And the federal police were working with the state police.
And the government wasn't helped by not having the High Court judgment.
And he said, look, when the reasons come out, we'll look at legislating. So they didn't do nothing. They just didn't do what the opposition wanted to do.
They signed off on the legislation that was introduced later in the week on Monday night. I don't know why it wasn't introduced until Thursday morning.
But they were caught flat-footed on the politics.
Yeah, it was the politics.
They have been
on the politics.
Flat-footed on the politics. They have managed it poorly. And I think there is a question about some of the language that's been used, given that we do have a rule of law in this country that says when you've served your sentence, you're out in the community if you're an Australian. To be using some of the language that is being used is, it's a bit dangerous.
It's also sets a precedent for the first time where we've ever criminalised breach of visa conditions, and that's very concerning to people who study immigration law, study refugee law, because this could have ramifications further down the line. It could open them up to further legal challenges. The fact that there are minimum sentences for breaching those conditions, 1 year in jail for, say, for example, forgetting or not realising you have to let the department know that you have contact with a child. Like, those are all really important legal questions that we have no idea how they're going to work.
And there is a preventative detention regime in this country for people convicted of terrorism offences. So government under law can go back to courts and say, we actually want to keep these people in ongoing detention beyond the end of their sentence because they pose a threat. That's related to terrorism offences.
And importantly, the court has to.
And the court has to deal with it. There's not that thing for a murder offence, for example. So if this is going forward going to be some kind of permanent regime, there's an argument that they will need to have some kind of preventative detention regime that applies to this cohort that is lawful, because what they had is not.
Likewise with the curfews and the ankle bracelets, just really important to stress that those conditions are only placed on the most serious offenders in Australia. Now, to have that across the board potentially, we don't know about this ministerial discretion argument, but to have that across the board potentially for people who may have committed minor offences, again, raises a question of proportionality, which is a legal question.
Just on the politics of this, I mean, this was right in Peter Dutton's lane, the former Minister for Immigration, Border Protection, hard man on national security. So look, he was all over this from the get-go. But what about his suggestion that you can simply lock them up again, put them all back into detention?
Well, you can't.
Immigration detention.
You can't, and that's the point I'm just making, that unless you have a whole new regime that covers this cohort of people, and then does it cover Australians who we think are of bad character who finish serving their sentence? Because the court has said there's a problem if there's a discrepancy between the legal circumstances of Australians and people who are not Australians. So you can't just put them back in. That is the whole point.
But
so that was overreach on the opposition.
The politics play well, though, because when you say to the public, let's lock up sex offenders, let's lock up pedophiles, that plays out so well. People love that without realising any of the legal ramifications.
Labor just got absolutely avalanched. As one of them said to me, just life, the world went from 0 to 1,000 miles an hour in 72 hours last week. I mean, talkback radio, breakfast TV, everyone was going gangbusters on this, and the government was just,
that narrative run away.
Dutton just threw a match on the
And as they always say, the first job of a government is to keep people safe, to keep Australians safe, but they also have to make them feel safe. That's why the politics are important.
It was a big political, as someone said, we got reamed. I think that was probably summed it up. Yeah.
All right. Well, time to talk to the Shadow Minister for Home Affairs, James Paterson, about it. To take us there, here was the opposition leader arguing those who've been released should go back into immigration detention.
I want to be clear to the Australian people today. The Prime Minister has taken a decision not to re-detain these 84 serious criminals.
He needs to fix the problem with legislation in the Parliament this week to make sure that those people go back into immigration detention and that they don't pose a threat to the broader community.
If I was writing the government's policy, these people would be back in detention. 8 are still held within immigration detention. Why can you hold the 8 but not the 92? So I think they have got a power to hold the 82 are now 84, and they're refusing to do it.
Senator, welcome to the program.
Good morning, David.
So let's just start by clearing this up. Peter Dutton says, we heard there repeatedly, these people should go back into immigration detention. You've argued indefinite immigration detention is not the solution. Why?
David, when the High Court handed down its decision on Wednesday last week, the Senate was sitting, and I gave my first media interview about this on Thursday. And I said the government should be ready with legislation to introduce in the Senate, and it should consider the high-risk terrorist offenders regime as a possible solution to this problem. That includes things like preventative detention orders, continuing detention orders, extended supervision orders and control orders, and the government was not ready and they did not do that. Those could have been used to detain, at the very least, the highest risk among this cohort of now 93 people, which, by the way, the government has not explained. The Solicitor General told the High Court there were 92 people who needed to be immediately released. We've now hit 93, and the question is open, have we started to move into that cohort of 340? Who are they? What offences have they committed, and when and where were they released into the community?
They're all interesting questions, but can I come back to the one I asked you? Peter Dutton is saying put them back in immigration detention. Is that possible?
Well, David, we're the opposition and we've tried to be constructive about this. We've tried to suggest a range of options of dealing with this, including, as I said, the high-risk terrorist offenders framework, which critically would allow the government to apply to a court for a court to detain someone on the basis of the risk that they pose to the community. It's a well-accepted and well-tested area of law that could be applied at the very least to the highest-risk offenders in this cohort. The government doesn't appear willing to test that, at least not until they have the High Court's advice. But in the meantime, we've got people out in the community who may pose a risk to the community. I think that's very unfortunate.
OK, but just one more time. When Peter Dutton says putting them back in immigration detention, are you saying that's impossible?
No, David, I'm saying that the government should investigate all lawful options. We've all been really clear about this.
But is immigration detention one of them?
Consistent with the High Court's ruling.
You yourself have said that they cannot go back into indefinite immigration detention?
David, we're the opposition. We're trying to be constructive about this. We don't have the benefit of the legal advice that the government does. But what we're saying is they need to look at all the lawful options. And I think it's very clear that they haven't done that. It's very clear that they were caught on the hop when the High Court handed down its ruling on Wednesday. It's very clear that they didn't have legislation ready to introduce to the Senate, which was sitting, which could have passed on Thursday of last week and could have been introduced into the House on Monday of this week. And this all could have been avoided.
So let's look at your idea then of preventative detention. I think you just said for the highest risk offenders. So you're not saying everybody locked up. How would it work, what you're suggesting?
Well, we have a very mature high-risk terrorist offenders framework in this country, which recognises that some types of offenders, including terrorist offenders, are not able to be easily rehabilitated in prison and do pose a continuing risk to the community if they are released after the end of their custodial sentences. And so the police can apply through the courts for them to be detained on a continuing basis. They can even apply to the courts to have them detained preventatively before they are convicted. And this offers the community some measure of protection that they are not out in the community and can't cause harm to the community. And I really think the government should be looking at that as an option because for at least some of this cohort, we know they are very serious violent offenders. I mean, in the government's own words, in a document that we obtained through an order of production of documents in the Senate, which was handed to the court a month ago, they described these offenders as very serious offenders and ranging from sexual crimes to murder to child sex abuses. This really should have been considered well before the court handed down its decision.
And this new regime that you're suggesting here, a preventative detention regime, would it only apply to those on these what are they called, removal pending visas that have now been set up, or would it more broadly apply to all non-citizens?
Well, I think this is a special cohort because they normally would be detained, and the only reason that they're not detained is that there's no reasonable prospect of them being either sent back to the country that they originally came from or being resettled in a third country, and that's important. It's either because they are stateless, it's either because they do have a well-founded fear of persecution back in their home country, and it is often because no third country will take them because of the severity of the crimes that they have committed. So ordinarily they would be removed from the country, their visa would be cancelled, they would be deported, or they would remain in detention. Because that's not an option, I think we do have to look at measures like this.
And just to clear up what has passed through the Parliament the other day, this question about ministerial discretion for the ankle bracelets and the curfews and so on. What's your understanding of how much discretion there is?
David, we proposed 6 amendments to the government which they accepted in principle, and it was our intention that most, if not all of these conditions would be mandatory. The government came back to us after receiving legal advice and they said that that would be problematic and it would risk the validity of these laws. So instead what they have introduced in their amendments, which they drafted for the opposition, was a presumption that these measures do apply unless the minister believes these people do not pose a risk to the community. Now that's a pretty high bar. You have to be convinced that there's no risk to the community if you are to not impose, for example, an electronic bracelet or a curfew. And so it's my expectation that all or almost all of those offenders will have these conditions applied to them.
Even those who may not have been convicted of an offence?
Well, the government will be in possession with a range of information in relation to these detainees. Let me tell you, these visas are not cancelled without good reason. It's because they've either committed a crime or they've violated the character provisions of the Migration Act. And so they all do pose a degree of risk, but of course some are more risky than others. And only the minister's in possession of that information. It's not something that they're sharing with the opposition or the public. And so they have to make that decision and the burden falls on them.
Look, let's turn to the incident between HMAS Toowoomba and a Chinese vessel in international waters off Japan. As we mentioned, some Australian Navy personnel have been left with minor injuries. You said yesterday this is not the actions of a friend. How then would you describe China if not a friend?
Well, it's certainly a strategic competitor. I agree with the Biden administration's assessment of that. And the actions that we have seen this week are totally contrary to the spirit of friendship that we saw at the Great Hall of the People when the Prime Minister was in Beijing only a few weeks ago. I think when it comes to our very complex and important bilateral relationship with the People's Republic of China, that we really have to look at the actions of the Chinese government, not just their words. It's very easy to get caught up in the platitudes and the praise, the handsome boy rhetoric when the Prime Minister was in Beijing. but actually it's pretty fundamental things like this, which was an active decision by the People's Liberation Army Navy to put Australian Navy personnel in harm's way and cause harm to them, that we should be really judging the Chinese government by.
So what should happen? Serious concerns have been expressed government to government. Is that enough?
Well, the first and most important thing, David, is we have to understand whether or not the Prime Minister raised this with Xi Jinping or Wang Yi when he met with them at APEC in San Francisco. He's boasted about the length and the depth of the conversations that they had when he met them there. He would have known before he left Australia that this incident has occurred. The question for the Prime Minister to answer today, now that he's back in the country, is did he raise this and take this up on the behalf of the Australian people and our Navy personnel? I mean, this is a serious incident. Harm has been caused, injuries have been caused to Australian Navy personnel in what appears to be a deliberate act by the Chinese Navy.
Do you accept, the government points out it takes some days for the checks and balances to be absolutely clear. This is what happened under the Morrison government when a Chinese warship targeted a laser beam into an Australian surveillance vessel. It took 5 days before that could be cleared and announced.
I guess, David, it's possibly just a coincidence that the government waited until Saturday morning after the Prime Minister had done his press conference in APEC and after he'd boarded his plane back home to Australia, that they decided to publicly release this information online. It's up for them to explain, but the most important thing is the Prime Minister did know while he was in San Francisco. So did he raise it with Xi Jinping or did he not?
Let's turn to the war in Israel and Gaza. You're a staunch supporter of Israel. Is that support unqualified, unconditional, or you know, what sort of limits or guardrails should there be around how far Israel can go?
David, I support Israel because Israel is a liberal democracy, and I've said all throughout this conflict that we expect Israel to behave as a liberal democracy. But let's not forget the assault that happened on Israel on the 7th of October. If that happened here in Australia, in per capita terms, it would be about 3,000 Australians that lost their lives. How would we expect our government to respond if we were on the receiving end of an attack like that? Hamas has said that they intend to repeat the events of 7 October again and again and again. That is their political and military objective. And so I think it's completely understandable that the State of Israel doesn't want to live with that existential risk and wants to remove Hamas as a military threat to its people.
But does that mean Israel needs to follow international law?
Of course, all nations, all parties to conflict have to follow the international rules of conflict, David.
And you're confident Israel is?
It's not easy for me to judge from 12,000 kilometres away and in the fog of war. There's been a lot of misinformation, including earlier on in the conflict when Hamas claimed, and the many in the media, including the ABC, reported that Israel had bombed a hospital. It later emerged that it was a Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket which had misfired and fallen on the hospital. So I think we do need to be careful about casting judgment from this far away in the middle of a conflict.
So does that mean you're not willing to cast judgment on whether it's following international law?
Judgment will be cast, David, but it will be cast after this conflict is over and through the normal appropriate processes of international law, as it should be.
What about the rights of the people of Gaza, the civilians in Gaza? What rights do you think they have?
Well, they have a right not to be treated by Hamas as human shields. They have a right not to be held as hostages by Hamas. It's not just 239 Israelis, it's 2 million Gazans who are being used by Hamas as hostages in their conflict. They deliberately burrowed themselves in civilian infrastructure, including apartments, including schools, including hospitals, including refugee camps, and they use those civilians both as a human shield to protect them, but also as a propaganda weapon against Israel when inevitably civilian casualties occur. So Israel must do everything it can to minimise those civilian casualties. But Hamas has options here too, David. The war would end tomorrow if Hamas released those citizens, the captives. The war would end tomorrow if the Hamas leadership gave up.
We got reduced there when it comes to just the conversation we were having earlier around the what's been passed through the Parliament and what still needs to happen. James Paterson is talking about a preventative detention regime that would be a new regime along the lines of what happens, as you were explaining, Karen, with terrorists.
Yeah, but there is, and none of the people that we're dealing with here are convicted terrorists, and there is a question, again, the government is a bit hamstrung because it hasn't seen the court's reasons, and so in crafting such a regime, if it was going to do that, it needs to understand the legal principles upon which the decision was based. So they are in a bit of a limbo land.
And they've left
legally.
open the prospect of tweaking or new legislation once they've got those reasons.
Yeah, and the two issues here, as the Senator just said, are that this is indefinite detention for people who cannot be returned anywhere else, and they're not Australian citizens. Those are the two key issues at the heart of this High Court judgment, and the government has to be mindful of the law and the fact that the court has said that this was effectively continued punishment beyond the punishment that the courts have allowed, and it has to weigh up all of those considerations and then see the reasons and craft some kind of regime if it wants to put these people back in detention.
But he is a bit more nuanced than Peter Dutton when it comes to just locking them up.
Yeah, he does the facts. the leader does the adjectives, I think, in this case. But
there's also the fact that, you know, legally immigration detention was never designed to be incarceration. So that then poses its own question of, if you can't send people home because they can't be sent home and they can't be released into the community, what do you really do with them? And that's not answered legally in any way.
Now, on the Israel-Hamas war that we were just talking about there was a heated exchange between the government, between the opposition leader and the Prime Minister on Wednesday afternoon in the Parliament, when Peter Dutton levelled a pretty serious charge that clearly got under Anthony Albanese's skin.
This Prime Minister needs to stand up and to be united with the Jewish community, and he's not. The words have been qualified, the message divided.
To come in here and move this resolution and link anti-Semitism with the decision of the High Court is beyond contempt. Beyond contempt.
Order.
This is the same political party
The member for Fairfax.
that tried to repeal Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act.
And for those with a long memory, the 18C was, well, it protects against offend, insult and humiliate on racial grounds. The Libs tried to get rid of it. The Jewish groups want to keep it as a protection against anti-Semitism. But on that exchange, Phil, you were sitting there in the chamber as well. It was pretty strong stuff.
Yeah, it was. Yeah.
What did you make of, did Peter Dutton overreach by throwing in the anti-Semitism stuff?
I think by his own admission he did, because, pardon me, he didn't mention it again after that. You know, the next couple of days as this story rattled on. What he was trying to do that day, was Wednesday, in a very crude sense, was we've got the High Court releasing, you know, murderers and rapists into the streets, and we've got anti-Semitism rampant, and it's very, very serious what's going on. You've got any Jewish friends or colleagues, just talk to them about how, especially in Melbourne, it's terrible. And he's trying to say the Prime Minister's got these two, you know, huge, big problems, and he's off overseas again. It was a very sort of, you know, crude exercise, if you like. But I think, you know, he got so much blowback for conflating these two issues, and I think one is far graver than the other. I think the anti-Semitism is far graver than this court decision, and the next couple of days the Libs didn't mention anti-Semitism in the context of this argument for this legislation, so I think by their own admission.
Do you feel as though perhaps part of the reason that anti-Semitism was brought up was Peter Dutton's attempt to maybe appeal to some of these teal seats that it lost?
That's definitely a byproduct. I would tell you, I mean, for the same reason the Greens, you know, 100% pro-Palestinian, and for the same reason Labor has sort of had trouble with finding their line of length on this from the start because of their own, you know, their own demographics in their seats. You know, big Jewish populations in seats like Wentworth, Goldstein, and Kooyong. I mean, the coalition's always been fairly pro-Israeli anyhow. It's not like they've had to bung it on, but it's certainly, I think.
But look, I think the simple point he's trying to make is you've got this royal and community tension over this, and now over detainees being released and the Prime Minister's overseas again. I mean, it's a very blunt point, but a lot when you accuse the Prime Minister and the government, I suppose, of not doing enough to stamp out anti-Semitism, that's a pretty serious charge. Is there grounds to make that claim?
Well, the Prime Minister said that he'd been speaking to members of the Jewish community who had thanked him for his public comments in the wake of a couple of events in Melbourne, in Caulfield last weekend, where there were protests outside a synagogue in particular. So, but this, you know, this whole thing is on a knife's edge. Language is super important. I think that the opposition leader was trying to make a political point that he was accusing the government of failing to keep Australians safe, and that's why you link those two things together. Now, you can make a political point to that effect, but when you do it in this context, it has extra weight and extra volatility. We also saw this week the Scanlon Foundation's annual report on social cohesion come out that does suggest that social cohesion is increasingly a problem in this country. There is a problem with anti-Semitism. There is also a problem with Islamophobia. Now, I know people get upset when you mention both of those things in the same conversation at the moment, because when we talk about anti-Semitism in the current context, it's about one horrific event and the things that have flowed from that. When we talk about Islamophobia, it's about an undercurrent of Islamophobia that has existed in this country for a long time. The foundation found that the snapshot that it took, which obviously was a little while ago, showed that Islamophobia was worse. But there is no doubt that anti-Semitism has spiked and is on the rise in this current context. And I think everyone has to be so careful with their language to not be inflaming any of this. People in all of these communities are suffering deeply. And this is the other point. It's different to other issues, I think, because so many people in this country are directly affected, directly involved, or feel directly involved. And there's a level of sensitivity and volatility around it that puts extra responsibility on everyone speaking publicly to be careful not to inflame.
But I think also the political context to all of this is we've just come out of, several months of often toxic, bruising conversations towards First Nations people when it comes to the voice to Parliament. That told a lot of people, not just First Nations people, but people of colour, immigrants, that if you just scratch the surface, you will find racism in this country. It's not hard to find. And that is the context to all of this, that we're now seeing, particularly anti-Semitism, anti-Islamophobia, anti-Islam sentiment being spoken about and politicised in Parliament after we have seen just how difficult it is to talk about race in any kind of sensible way in this country. And so to pour fuel on the fire by making these political statements, I think is really, really damaging to social cohesion. As Karen said, I think this was the lowest ever recording of social cohesion from the Scanlon report. Fewer than 50% of people said they felt a great affinity or felt a great sense of being Australian. That's deeply worrying, and we have politicians who are considering point scoring rather than considering the effect of their words. As
to what's happening on the ground, because so much of what's happening here depends on how this war is unfolding, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu made an interesting comment where he was talking about how Israel's going in managing its efforts to manage keeping civilian casualties to a minimum.
We'll try to finish that job with minimal civilian casualties. That's what we're trying to do. Minimal civilian casualties, but unfortunately, we're not successful.
Not successful, he said, because Hamas puts civilians in harm's way, and point James Paterson was trying to make there as well. But you can even hear from a staunch Israel supporter like James Paterson some caution about making a judgment call on how Israel's going.
Netanyahu himself overnight gave another address to the Israeli people and spoke about the Iron Dome of diplomacy, how important it was for Israel to maintain support for the operation in Gaza, and so he acknowledged that they were having trouble with that. The PR, if you like, for want of a better term.
And this incident overnight,
before the UN school got hit, but they announced overnight, and it's just the most minute of concessions, they're going to allow 2 fuel trucks a day into Gaza to run the sewage and water pumps, and that's basically a disease prevention measure. And he even qualified it in the context of it's not just about the residents of Gaza, but the IDF troops in Gaza, for their own health. But he's obviously even someone as hardline as Netanyahu who's now sort of sensitive to this. But he's very absolute. I mean, he said I'll quote him. He said, "We will only agree to a temporary ceasefire and only in the return for the release of the hostages." So, I mean, even if you can get some respite at the moment, Hamas could release the hostages. They could do that. And this thing could calm down a bit. It's not an impossible thing to do. But even in that context, Netanyahu has listed 3 aims. One's the destruction of Hamas, one's the return of the hostages, and the third is to ensure Israel can never be attacked again from inside Gaza, which I think is, ambitious.
Now, our problems here look so mild compared to what's happening on the ground over there. Nonetheless, there's been plenty of outcry this week coming back here over the government cutting funding for a bunch of infrastructure projects. It follows a review into the $120 billion pipeline of infrastructure projects. The review itself Karen, I don't think the full thing's been released.
So there are two reviews actually, and just to correct you slightly, it's not that they're cutting funding, they've cancelled projects. So they're making the point that...
Cancelled funding for those projects.
Yes, so they're making the point that the funding that was available to the states remains in place, but certain of those projects, $7 billion worth of them, cannot proceed because they're either not viable, the cost blowout is too great, there's not enough preparation being done, whatever. So they're saying the states will still get money, but they can't use it on those projects. The two reviews were one by Mike Murdoch, former head of the Infrastructure Department, which was looking at the projects, and one by Jane Holton, former head of the Finance Department, which was looking at the whole process of the agreements with the states that underpins these projects. So she was looking at the process and he was looking at the specific examples. She has... The Holton review has been released in full. It's quite scathing of the process. It finds holes in the process. It says that the word approved keeps being bandied around, and when in fact some projects hadn't gone through all the stages for approval, they were at an earlier stage, but preceding government in particular, had been using the word approved where it shouldn't have. She raises the question about COVID stimulus in infrastructure and says it's important to be able to turn projects on and off when you need it in a pandemic like that, but you have to be able to turn them off, and there isn't a proper review. She says that should be reviewed, and there's no review process by the government for that.
So once something's announced, that's it?
Yeah, and Mike Murdoch's review, the problem we've got there is they've only released the executive summary, so we don't know what the whole report says. They've given out a list of the projects being cancelled. We've only got the summary.
Did the review say these are the projects that should be?
Yeah, and I'm told it was absolutely scathing on some of those projects, but we can't see the whole thing. And the argument there is, we got the states to cooperate with us by promising we wouldn't publish what they said, so we can't give it to you.
Well, of course, Hockey.
We'll see.
Yeah, my curiosity is, I think this is the Murdoch review recommended 82 projects get the bullet, and the government came out and announced 50 were getting the bullet, and we don't know the other 32. Coincidentally, I haven't found a disappointed Labor MP yet, or a non-Labor MP in a really marginal seat that's gettable.
Well, the minister, Catherine King, I mean, she says, look, the 120 billion will still flow, as you say, Karen. They're not cutting the size of the pie.
Money,
it's just all the blowouts in these projects. It means they've had to trim some off. And here's how she describes the ones they're cutting funding for.
When you've got a project where there is no commitment from a state government to put any money in at all, no interest from the state government to build it, and not enough money really to even build a tiny part of it, you've got to take a hard decision about that. And unfortunately, I've had to do that.
Well, the states, just to show you this, take a slightly different view. They clearly are interested in some of these projects that are now on the chopping block. Here was the backlash or the blowback from some of the premiers.
I'm very concerned about it. I'm not going to gild the lily here. I mean, that's a major concern for the New South Wales government.
We will stand up to the federal government, we will stand up to the Prime Minister and say Queensland deserves its fair share, and we will accept nothing less.
They'll stand up and they'll tweet as well. The Queensland Treasurer, Cameron Dick, sent this one out. Our message to Catherine King: treat Queensland more like Qantas and less like Qatar.
Well, the other reason they're so upset, David, is not only that these projects have been cancelled, but the funding formula has been changed, and I think that's what's really upset them.
So 50-50 now, isn't it?
Yeah, it used to be 80-20. Right. It used to be 80% of the federal government to 20% contribution. Now it's half and half. So the states are going to have to find more money for the projects that they do pursue, and they're not very happy.
Queensland's got a great big fat budget surplus on their coal royalties. So,
and an election coming.
Yeah, I mean, the politics of this is fascinating on a number of fronts. You know, what's been overlooked largely, there's a big anti-inflationary element to this.
Well, this is what the IMF and the Reserve Bank
there's such a sort of massive amount of infrastructure projects and so few resources to build them that by sort of scaling it back and getting rid of the ones, as the Minister said, we're never going to get built anyway, or not in the never, it sort of takes that pressure off it. So the federal government's looking at the inflationary impact of it. The opposition says, well, the best way to boost productivity, and productivity in this country is stuffed, is to build infrastructure. So they're removing...
So they're saying cut spending, but not here.
So that's that argument. And then the states, of course, I mean, Anthony Albanese thought Labor premiers would be their friend. They're no one's friends. Premiers are their own friends, right? And the Queenslanders go to the polls in October next year.
And beating up on Canberra doesn't hurt.
Oh, Canberra. Well, look at COVID. Canberra bashing works a treat. So whether what Anastasia Palaszczuk and Cameron Dick said during the week is the harbinger of more to come will be very worrying for the feds, because the Queenslanders always believe the Queensland government over anything Canberra does. And the federal government has 5 of 30 seats in Queensland. If it doesn't get seats in Queensland in the next election, it probably will go back into minority government. So it sets up this, the Battle of Queensland, if you like. So just how fair Dinkum, Dick and Palaszczuk are going to be, or will they just let it rest?
Jumping in with that though, they might, the feds might have a problem with the states, and obviously don't, that saying, don't ever get in the way of a pot of money and a premier. But I don't think they have a voter problem, because I think voters are so cynical about any kind of money allocation at the moment towards projects. We've seen years of rules, things that just haven't eventuated. So when it comes to voters, voters are like, meh, that's just like a thinly veiled voting.
And I agree, because
you've got a big migration intake over the last 12 months. Is putting pressure on infrastructure. You don't think voters, wouldn't mind a better road or?
Yeah, but I think Shalala has a point. I mean, infrastructure is just so impenetrable. I mean, I've seen projects announced by 4 different governments, and still haven't started. But the point, but where the danger is, if there's a specific project, everyone's looking forward to their bypass or their bridge or something, and that's just, and now they're not going to get it. And you've got a state government like the Queensland government, which is in trouble and may well lose, and they'll just do whatever it takes to, we'll throw whatever they have at Canberra. We'll just see how far, if they continue this carry on the other side of Christmas. It could be.
Now, final one. The Prime Minister has been at the APEC summit. He's back now. The big focus over in San Francisco, though, was on the meeting between Joe Biden and Xi Jinping. 2 leaders of the 2 big powers. It was a well-choreographed meeting. They walked around the garden and, agreed to re-establish military-to-military ties. Really important. A few other things as well. But then after all of this, the US president's doing his press conference, and it's one of those walkout moments where he's halfway out the door and gets questions lobbed at him, including this one. Do you describe Xi Jinping as a dictator?
Mr. President, after today, would you still refer to President Xi as a dictator? This is a term that you used earlier this year.
Well, look, he is. I mean, he's a dictator in the sense that he is a guy who runs a country that is a communist country that's based on a form of government totally different than ours.
He is a dictator. I want to show you a different camera angle. The shot of Antony Blinken, Joe Biden's Secretary of State, sitting there watching on as his boss said those words.
Xi as a dictator, this is a term that you used earlier this year.
Well, look, he is. I mean, he's a dictator in the sense that he is a guy who runs a country that...
Oh dear, so good.
He's
I think you call that unhelpful.
How should you answer that question?
You got in trouble for asking Albo at the Prime Minister story
whether he trusted Xi Jinping. Well, Joe Biden got asked the same thing.
Well, Prime Minister Albanese in that instance had a good answer. It was a good question. It was warranted, given what the US President had said to Anthony Albanese in Washington before the visit, and the Prime Minister gave a good answer. I just don't think Joe Biden was as fleet-footed as he... I mean, he was right. He is a dictator. But,
the PM did get asked after that encounter while he was over there, and his answer was, I guess, the one you should give, where you reframe the question and you say, we have different political systems. Don't use the word. But on the relationship with China and Australia, this incident we were talking about earlier involving HMAS Toowoomba in the waters off Japan, well, there's a couple of things. The incident itself, the use of sonar pulses, it sounds pretty
bad for the ears.
Serious, yeah. It can give you headaches and other issues. I think for those Navy divers, some minor injuries apparently. But they were warned to stay away. They were warned there were divers down there, and they didn't stop. What does that tell us about where the relationship's at?
Well, on the surface, we're all friends again with trade in mind, but underneath, and no...
Pardon the pun.
No pun intended, yeah, that's right. We have differences, significant differences. The Australian government referred to that as unsafe and unprofessional conduct. That is the case at the very least. So it's clear that Chinese didn't care that the warnings were issued and still behaved in that manner. I don't think there's an apology been issued that we've heard about. It's all a bit unclear who said what to whom about this, but it was a dangerous act and a provocative act. And the point the Prime Minister was making about re-engaging with China, ostensibly on the economy, but in general, is that their miscalculations and misunderstandings and mistakes are less likely when you are talking to each other. Well, this is one of those things somewhere.
Maybe it takes a little while to trickle down.
We're very early in the process of re-engaging that, so, you know, potentially...
I wouldn't excuse that behaviour on that.
I'm not excusing it. I'm just saying, like, diplomatically, we still have a really long way to go. This is the first step.
But this just shows you that provocative acts can, you know, they can cause big problems.
And what about the line from the opposition that the PM should have raised this or could have raised this with Xi Jinping in one of those, what do we call those pull-aside moments at the APEC summit?
We'll never know.
Do we know if he did? Yeah. Do we know if they
probably
don't
wouldn't
know?
tell us.
Yeah.
It's unclear.
But no, well, it would be warranted if he did. But I mean, when we were in China with the Prime Minister, he was eyes wide open. I mean, I know all the handsome boy stuff and, you know, wobbling lobsters around at the trade fair, but he said in every utterance, you know, this relationship has many difficulties and differences ahead. Don't get carried away. This is you know, a stabilisation, not a normalisation. So it's not like, you know, the government was taken by surprise by this incident, as much as they didn't like it. This is going to continue, and that whole side of the relationship is a long way of being reconciled. But I think it should have been raised while he was over there, and I think James Paterson had a point that the PM flew out before they released the news. I mean, you'd have to think that's deliberate. Conspicuous timing, although, as I say, the government points to the previous government did take days to make the checks and before you announce something, but what the PM knew and what he might have been able to say to President Xi while he was there is still a little unclear. All right, our panel, Shalila Medora, Phil Curry and Karen Middleton, will be back shortly with some final observations. Time now for Mike Bowers, Talking Pictures.
I'm Mike Bowers and I'm photographer at large for The Guardian Australia. I'm talking pictures this morning with photographer for the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, Alex Ellinghausen. And a very warm welcome.
Good morning, Mike. Thanks for having me.
Alex, we're lucky we live in a peaceful country, but sometimes events from overseas can spill into domestic politics, and that was very much the case this week.
Yeah, we've seen these huge rallies all around the world, all around Australia, and at the front of Parliament.
First up was the Palestinians, the support of the Palestinians.
Emotions ran really strong at both these rallies.
Both outside and inside the building this week.
Yep. So we saw the effigies representing people that were killed, or the empty prams and the balloons of people that are missing.
Yeah. It made for a very powerful visual about how many people were actually involved in this. Kathy Wilcox has done the minefield. Just be careful where you step, and they've got
ceasefire,
apartheid,
collective punishment,
settlements,
genocide,
war crime, and ethnic cleansing. There was a battle of words in the House this week as Peter Dutton tried to tie events from overseas with domestic politics. There was genuine anger within the House of Representatives.
The Prime Minister's expression, I think, really summed it up. He was like, what?
He was genuinely, where is this going?
Yeah, and I remember we both looked at each other thinking, this is going to get heated.
Yeah, you've captured him here with really sort of quite tight. You can see there's little folds on his skin. They're quite tightly clenched fists.
Yeah, I mean, look at the expression on his face. I think there was a lot of genuine emotion in the way that he spoke.
It's not often you see that sort of real raw emotion on display. One of the things we look for as a still, of course, when there's real tension in the House, is when there's a division, they have to sometimes cross from one side to the other. The eyes pass to the right of the chair, the nose to the left.
And you can tell that crossover was frosty.
Yeah, it definitely was. I did love this David Rowe. He's absolutely nailed it, I think, with Albo is anti-set, and it's like, damn, this thing's not going to fit on the High Court. Alex, dog whistleblowing might get you some attention in Parliament, but military whistleblowing will get you into court, as David McBride found out this week. What's with getting me in it? I ran into a pole.
These things happen when you're buried behind a viewfinder sometimes.
It made really good photos because he bought his assistant's dog.
Yeah, Jake, his therapy dog. This scene we got right here is him being welcomed and cheered to court by his supporters.
He even had his own trucks with advertising on it. We had a privately owned one.
This other one looks like a formerly used fire truck.
I'd say it is.
Yeah, look, I think he really appreciated the support.
Lovely Matt Golding, who's got the camouflaged army outfit and the camouflage with targets on it, the ADF whistleblower.
Yeah.
John Kadelka's picked up on the whistleblowing. He's got the Whistleblower Memorial.
Please observe a minute's silence, then maintain that silence if you know what's good for you.
Yeah, that's exactly
right. It's really stuck.
It is one of those cartoons that gets right to the hub of the matter in a way that maybe 2,000 words wouldn't. Alex, the Photoshop fail of the week goes to another Alex, the member for Mitchell, Alex Hawke. He's got a beautiful family here, but people have spotted one of his campaign pamphlets that he's had printed has got himself just floating in the air.
In a very formal attire, while his family is very casually dressed.
Why wouldn't you just put yourself in the corner and make it look like you've just added it afterwards rather than Photoshopping?
I know. It's very odd.
Alex, it's been a difficult week, but it's been a great pleasure unpicking the events. I'll let you do the honours.
Thanks, Mike, and back to you, David.
He pops up everywhere, Alex Hawke. Mike, thank you both very much for that. Let's get some final observations. Shalila.
So earlier this week, the government responded to the Robodebt Royal Commission report and conveniently reclassified one of the recommendations, saying, no, the recommendation on changing the FOI Act wasn't a recommendation at all. It was just a suggestion.
Just a suggestion.
Just a suggestion. Look, it raises an important issue about transparency in this country, because that was a really key recommendation in the report that said if we don't have more eyes on policy and the way that policy is made, we will risk potentially having this really terrible policies continuing in the public. So I just think it was a really telling moment for the government.
Indeed. Phil, what do you got?
Oh, just a bit of brevity, Dave, after a tough week. There was a bill called the Crown References Amendment Act going through Parliament this week, and that's to change all the Queen references to the King references.
Right, yep.
And Bob Catter, debating it, acknowledged that in 50 years in politics, he's never sworn an oath to the Crown in either state or federal politics.
Is that right?
He hates them. And went on to say, we should boot King Charles. There should be no rules on anything, including the currency. He said, we've not grown up as a nation, and we're far from growing up as a nation. He says, Ralph Hiner, who's a Kokoda hero and an Indigenous warrior leader, Tubba Trace, he proposed, he probably going to
put them on the coins, is that what
Yeah, on the notes, and he's going to turn up in the next few weeks with big mock coins, and from what I understand. But he's not a Republican. So I couldn't...
Go figure.
Yeah,
that's a good one.
Anyway.
Karen.
Sorry to bring the tone down again. Just going back to the point about whistleblowers, we saw this week the Attorney General release a discussion paper in terms of further protections for whistleblowers, which is very important, whistleblower protections. We also saw the David McBride case that was mentioned in Talking Pictures. I think in the interests of recording facts accurately, it's important to point out that David McBride was a whistleblower, but I think the public understanding of what he did is slightly wrong. He was not blowing the whistle to reveal war crimes. He has acknowledged he was doing the reverse. He was passing on information about these events to argue that they were not war crimes, and there should be more protection for soldiers to do that kind of thing, not less. So it's pivoted in the public mind.
The result of his actions were the opposite.
Yes, and he didn't want the stories published that were published. So it's pivoted in the public mind to he's a champion against war crimes. He was not, and I think in the interests of accuracy, we should understand what happened. He's now pleaded guilty in that case.
Yeah, he had to plead guilty in the end. Thank you all very much for joining us this morning. Now, finally, it can be hard to keep a secret in politics, but the British Prime Minister pulled off quite a surprise during the week, bringing back one of his predecessors to become the new Foreign Secretary. And the reaction was priceless. We'll leave you with that. Thanks for watching.
Not quite sure who this might be. If somebody's sacked, then of course they don't come up Downing Street. That's done in private. That's the security detail just opening the door for
David Cameron. What? Wait. I was not expecting that.
You're making us all feel very excited about being here.